How far would you travel to save the person you love most? For 12-year-old Thomas, the answer was 200 miles of deadly wilderness, with nothing but a dying horse and his sister's fading heartbeat to guide him home. The fever had taken hold of her 3 days ago, and Thomas knew, the way a boy knows when winter's coming or when a horse is about to bolt, that time was slipping through his fingers like sand through a broken hourglass. He stood at the edge of their small homestead, watching the sun bleed red across the Colorado Territory sky, his sister's labored breathing echoing from the cabin behind him like a wounded bird's cry. Mary, only 8 years old, lay still as death beneath their mother's quilt, her face pale as creek stones, lips cracked and fever bright. Their parents had been gone 2 months now, taken by the same sickness that now claimed his sister, and Thomas felt the weight of the world pressing down on his 12-year-old shoulders like a millstone. The nearest doctor was in Denver, 200 miles of harsh wilderness away, through mountain passes and desert valleys, where men twice his age had lost their way and never returned. But as he watched Mary's small chest rise and fall in shallow, desperate gasps, Thomas felt something harden inside him, a resolve as unyielding as the iron his father had once worked at the forge. He would make that journey. He would bring back help. He would not let death take another soul from his family's broken circle. He moved through the cabin like a ghost, gathering what little he could carry: a canvas sack with hardtack and jerky, his father's old Colt revolver, too heavy for his small hands but necessary for the dangers ahead, and the $23 they'd saved beneath the loose floorboard. Mary stirred as he knelt beside her bed, her eyes fluttering open like butterfly wings. "Tommy," she whispered, her voice thin as a spider silk, "where are you going?" He smoothed the damp hair from her forehead, feeling the fire of fever burning beneath her skin. "I'm going to get help, Mary. You hold on now. You hold on tight." She nodded weakly, her trust in him absolute and heartbreaking, and Thomas felt tears threaten to break through the dam he'd built inside his chest. Dawn came like a reluctant witness to his departure, painting the mountains in shades of hope and desperation. Thomas saddled their old mare, Patience, a fitting name for a horse that had carried his family through countless hardships, and looked back at the cabin one last time. Mary's face appeared briefly at the window, pale and ethereal, before disappearing back into the shadows. He touched his heels to Patience's sides, and they began their impossible journey, the morning mist swirling around them like the ghosts of all the prayers he'd never learned to say. The first day passed in a blur of sagebrush and rolling hills, the landscape unchanging as a fever dream. Thomas had traveled this far with his father before, when they'd made the monthly trip to town for supplies, but beyond the familiar ridgeline lay country he knew only from his father's stories. Stories of flash floods and rattlesnakes, of men who'd gone mad from thirst and wolves that hunted in packs. As the sun reached its merciless peak, he stopped to rest in the shade of a lightning-struck cottonwood, sharing his meager water with Patience, while the horse's sides heaved from the climbing heat. He thought of Mary, wondered if she was still holding on, if Mrs. Henderson from the neighboring farm had checked on her as she'd promised. The thought of his sister dying alone while he rode through empty country filled him with a terror so profound it threatened to unhorse him entirely. By evening, he'd covered perhaps 20 miles, the mountains growing larger and more forbidding with each step. He made camp in a shallow draw, building a small fire from dead wood and trying to ignore the howling that echoed from the hills. Whether wolf or wind, he couldn't tell. Sleep came in fragments, broken by nightmares of Mary calling his name and his own inadequacy rising like floodwater around him. When dawn broke gray and cheerless, Thomas felt older than his years, as if the night had aged him in ways the sun never could. The second day brought the foothills, and with them, a new kind of exhaustion. Patience picked her way carefully over loose shale and hidden roots, her breathing labored in the thinner air. Thomas found himself talking to the horse, sharing his fears and hopes with her gentle ears, finding comfort in the rhythmic sound of her hooves against stone. "We're going to make it, girl," he whispered, his voice lost in the wind that howled through the pines. "We have to make it." But doubt crept into his heart like winter cold, and he began to understand why grown men sometimes failed to return from journeys like this. It was near midday when he saw the smoke rising from a distant valley, thin and gray against the mountain sky, a sign of human habitation in this vast wilderness. His heart leaped with desperate hope, and he urged patience toward the distant signal, praying to find someone who could help, or at least point him in the right direction. The descent was treacherous, loose rocks skittering away beneath the mare's hooves, but Thomas pressed on, driven by a determination that surprised even himself. The smoke led him to a small mining camp, a collection of rough-hewn cabins and lean-tos clustered around a played-out claim. The miners, 5 men with faces carved by wind and disappointment, looked up from their meager fire as Thomas rode into their midst, his small figure dwarfed by the surrounding peaks. "Well, I'll be damned," said one, a grizzled man with eyes like chips of flint. "Boy, what in the devil are you doing out here alone?" Thomas dismounted on shaking legs, his voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at his insides. "My sister's dying. I'm riding to Denver for a doctor." The men exchanged glances, and Thomas saw something shift in their expressions, a recognition of the impossible odds he faced, and perhaps a grudging respect for his courage. They shared their beans and coffee with him, these hard men touched by his desperation, and offered what help they could. "Denver's still 150 miles, the grizzled miner said, his voice gentle now. "Mountain passes between here and there that'll test a grown man, let alone a boy." But he also gave Thomas directions, warned him of the worst dangers, and pressed an extra canteen into his hands. "Your sister," another miner asked quietly, "how long has she been sick?" Thomas's throat tightened. "4 days now, maybe 5 by the time I get back." The men fell silent, and Thomas saw in their faces the same knowledge that haunted him, that time was running out like water through cupped hands. The 3rd day brought him to the high passes, where the air was thin enough to make his head swim, and the cold bit through his jacket like teeth. Patience struggled now, her breathing harsh and labored, and Thomas began to walk beside her, his own legs trembling with exhaustion. The trail wound between towering peaks that seemed to scrape the belly of the sky, and more than once he had to stop and rest, his young body pushed to its limits by the relentless climb. It was here, in the shadow of those indifferent mountains, that Thomas confronted the full weight of his solitude. A 12-year-old boy carrying the life of his sister in his desperate hands, surrounded by a wilderness that cared nothing for his hopes or fears. But he pressed on, driven by love and desperation in equal measure, his father's voice echoing in his memory. "A man does what needs doing, son, no matter the cost." And though he was still more boy than man, Thomas felt something shift inside him with each step, a hardening of resolve that would serve him well in the years to come. As evening painted the peaks in shades of gold and crimson, he crested the final pass and saw the valley spreading below him like a promised land. And there, perhaps 50 miles distant, the scattered lights of Denver twinkling like earthbound stars. The descent nearly killed him. Patience stumbled twice on the loose scree, and Thomas's legs cramped so badly he could barely walk. But as the hours passed and the valley floor grew closer, he felt a new strength flowing through him. Not the strength of body, which had long since failed him, but the strength of spirit that comes to those who refuse to surrender in the face of impossible odds. By dawn of the 4th day, he was riding through cultivated farmland, past houses with smoke rising from their chimneys, past children playing in dooryard gardens who stared at the dust-covered boy on the exhausted horse with wide, curious eyes. Denver rose before him like a miracle, its wooden buildings and bustling streets a testament to human persistence in the face of wilderness. Thomas rode straight to the first person he saw, a woman hanging laundry behind a boarding house, and his voice cracked as he spoke. "Please, ma'am, can you tell me where to find a doctor?" She looked at this hollow-eyed boy, at his trembling hands and dust-caked clothes, and something in her expression softened. "Dr. Morrison's office is 2 blocks down, son. Blue building with the white trim." Thomas touched his hat brim in thanks and urged Patience forward, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird seeking freedom. Dr. Morrison was a stern-faced man with gentle hands and eyes that had seen enough suffering to fill a dozen lifetimes. He listened to Thomas's story without interruption, his expression growing more grave with each word. "Son," he said finally, "your sister's been sick for 5 days now. That's a long time for a child her age." Thomas felt the bottom drop out of his world, but Dr. Morrison continued, "But if she's strong, if she's been fighting this long, there might still be hope. I'll come with you, but we'll need to move fast." The return journey was a blur of desperate haste and fading hope. Dr. Morrison had procured a wagon and a fresh team of horses, and they made the trip in 3 days, pushing hard through mountain passes and desert valleys, while Thomas prayed to every god he could remember. The doctor said little during the journey, but Thomas caught him studying the boy with something that might have been admiration. "You know," Dr. Morrison said as they crested the final ridge, "I've seen grown men turn back from journeys less difficult than the one you just made." Thomas didn't reply, his eyes fixed on the distant smoke rising from their cabin's chimney, a sign that Mrs. Henderson was still tending to Mary, still keeping vigil. They found Mary barely clinging to life, her breathing so shallow it was almost imperceptible, her skin translucent as parchment. Mrs. Henderson met them at the door, her face etched with exhaustion and sorrow. "She's been asking for you, Thomas," she whispered, "every day, asking when you'd come home." Dr. Morrison went to work immediately, his hands moving with practiced efficiency as he examined the girl, administered medicines from his leather bag, and did everything in his power to pull her back from the edge of the abyss. For 2 days, Mary hovered between life and death while Thomas sat beside her bed, holding her small hand in his own, whispering stories of his journey, of the miners who had helped him, and the mountains he had crossed for her sake. On the third day, her fever broke like a summer storm passing, and she opened her eyes, weak but clear, and smiled at her brother. "Tommy," she whispered, "you came back." He nodded, unable to speak past the tears that finally came, washing away the dust and fear and desperate hope of the past week. Dr. Morrison stayed for another week, making sure Mary's recovery was complete, and during the long evenings, he and Thomas would sit on the porch and talk about the journey that had tested the boy's mettle and found it true. "You saved her life," the doctor said one evening as the sun set over the Colorado Territory. "That ride you made, 200 miles through country that would challenge a seasoned frontiersman, it's the stuff of legend." Thomas shook his head, watching his sister through the window as she played with a doll Mrs. Henderson had brought her. "I just did what needed doing," he said, echoing his father's words. Years later, when Thomas had grown to manhood and Mary had married and raised children of her own, they would sometimes speak of that terrible week when death had stalked their small cabin and a 12-year-old boy had ridden through hell itself to bring back salvation. Mary would tell her children about their Uncle Thomas, about the journey that had transformed a frightened boy into a man of unshakable resolve, about the love that had carried him through mountain passes and desert valleys when hope itself seemed lost. And Thomas, gray-haired and weathered by time, would remember not the hardships of that journey, but the moment when Mary had opened her eyes and smiled, and he had known that sometimes, just sometimes, love and determination could triumph over even the darkest odds. The cabin still stood at the edge of the Colorado Territory, a monument to the family that had struggled and survived there. And on quiet evenings, when the wind whispered through the pines, you could almost hear the echo of a young boy's voice, promising his dying sister that he would bring help, no matter how far he had to ride or how impossible the journey seemed. It was a promise kept, a covenant with love itself, and proof that the human heart, when tested by fire and forged by desperation, could accomplish miracles that would humble the mountains themselves. If you enjoyed this incredible tale from the frontier, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories from the American West. Click on the video on the screen for another tale we think you will love.